guys. Oh, that's good, dude. Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see some familiar faces out there and some new faces as well. If you guys could open your Bibles up to the book of Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to be continuing on in our study in the heroes of faith. I just wanted to kind of add in, as Pablo just said a moment ago, I've been at Calvary Boise since 1995. So I've been there for quite some time, and so many of you guys have come over come over here with Reggie, and so glad to see some familiar faces that many of which I haven't seen in a while, like some very long while actually. Holy cow! And then so many new ones as well. I've heard so many great things. I know Reggie just loves serving here and being your guys' pastor. So we're going to pick up in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to start in verse 23. I'm going to set it up a little bit by kind of anchoring back into the broader themes of the text. But before we start there, could we open with a word of prayer? Father, we do just thank you so much that along with all of your church all over the world, from every tribe, every tongue, every nation, there are people even now, this day, the Lord's Day, celebrating you and your resurrection and worshiping your name. And we are here today in this little pocket of Boise, Idaho, opening your word and just asking, God, that as we do so, your spirit would be in this place, that your spirit would be instructing us, God, that you would be teaching us, guiding us into all truth. And Lord, that this time would not just be a time of us learning and growing, a time for some perhaps, if there's anybody in this room who doesn't know you, having just a moment in which they're enlightened to the truth of your gospel, but may this be a time, God, of sweet fellowship, a time of sweet communion when we together just acknowledge and express that we are in this world your body. We pray these things, God, in Jesus' holy name. Amen. So to kind of set up the backdrop to this passage, again, going back to the last several weeks, as you guys have been going through the book of Hebrews, going through chapter 11, just a reminder, I think that there are two verses in particular that really set the framework for what we're about to see, and not just this week, but also next week and the week following. And that is verse 1, in which we read a definition of faith, and the second one is verse 13, which I'm going to come back to verse 13 after or kind of towards the end of the study. But just a reminder of what verse 1 does. Hebrews 11 verse 1 tells us the definition of faith. A very important consideration, given that one of the big things that the early church was teaching that kind of cut against the current, kind of worked against maybe the traditional view of those who had grown up in the house of Israel under the law, was this idea that we are saved by God's grace through faith, not by the works of the law, which is something that just cut completely across what any normal Jewish person growing up in that time would have felt and thought. And so, of course, it's of extreme importance to try to figure out, well, what is faith? If we're saved by faith, we need to know what it is. And the author of Hebrews starts off by telling us a definition. So just a reminder of that definition, which is found in verse 1, tells us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things unseen. So just to kind of expand a little bit, the confidence of things hoped for, the assurance of things hoped for, this idea that we have a hope in the future, a hope that has not yet been realized. And what is faith? Well, partly faith is the confidence that the thing we're hoping for is going to come to pass. And of course, I think in the teachings of the early church, there were lots of things in the future that have not come to pass that were being hoped for. I'm going to just boil it down to kind of a simple one, though. The return of Christ to reign on his throne, where he brings an end to all suffering, where he wipes away every tear, where he finally brings some sense of meaning to this lost and dying world. That's a thing that is in the future. It's a thing that is not now. It's a thing that we're hoping for. And it's a thing which a lot of people have doubts about. A lot of people, a huge percentage of the world, just think it's not going to happen. And they laugh and scoff at the idea. So faith is partly the assurance of something in the future that is going to come to pass, this great thing. And of course, there are many promises of God which are still in the future. So we have an assurance of the thing hoped for. And then a conviction of the thing unseen. The idea that what you and I see here and now in this world is not all there is. We, of course, are I'm standing, you're sitting, here in a room with pillars and chairs and monitors and all of these kinds of things. We see these things, so we have the confidence these things are there. But do we have the confidence in the things that we cannot see? And this, of course, I think, if you think about these two things, this assurance of a thing that is hoped for and a conviction of something that you don't see, you can see pretty easily as we go through chapter 11, looking at the great men and women of faith, as you go through looking at their stories. What the author of Hebrews is doing is he's saying all of these people did these great, amazing things because they had an assurance of something coming in the future, and because they had a conviction that what they couldn't see was actually there. And to make that second part kind of come to life a little bit, we often live as if we do not have a conviction of the things unseen. And I'll just give you a simple example. How many sins in your life have you committed in private? Right? And I mean, there's any wide swath of possibilities of this, but the point is, it's a kind of thing that you would never do if there was somebody standing next to you, ever. You wouldn't even think about it. You wouldn't even be tempted to do it. But when you're in private, by yourself, and you know nobody sees you, you do it. You all know what I'm talking about, right? I think all of us have done things like that. What does that say about your conviction about things that are unseen? You don't do it when somebody's standing next to you. What does that tell you? It tells you you believe they're really there, and you think they actually care, and the temptation doesn't overtake you. But what about when you're by yourself and you give in? What does that say about what's going on in your mind? It means your conviction that there's somebody standing there right next to you watching. Maybe it's a little weaker. Maybe you don't have the confidence. That's essentially what the author is getting at with this definition now. Having said that, last couple weeks, we looked at great heroes of the faith, spent a lot of time on Abraham, a little bit of time on his kids, and now we go, of course, to Moses. So we're going to pick up in verse 23 about Moses. By faith, and again, when you introduce any of these characters, it always starts by describing something they do visibly, physically, something measurable that you can point at, and then it says they did this by faith, meaning they did it because they believed. So, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents. One thing to note, this is not Moses' faith. This is his parents' faith. By faith, they hid him. Because they, I love this verse, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. I love it because I can't, every time I read it, in fact, I struggled the most over this verse. It sounds like what it's saying is his parents were like, you guys know the context, right? The king of Egypt is concerned because Israel is growing in number, and he decides to deal with this number problem, especially because he doesn't want them to outpace and outgrow the Egyptians, because if you have more slaves than you have citizens, that's a problem, because slaves revolt, right? The Haitian Revolution, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the Haitian Revolution that took place in the early 18th century, was a slave revolt. Haiti was under the control of French colonizers, and the Haitian islands were, or the Haitian island, I should say, was dominated by, population-wise, slaves. To kind of put it in comparison, of course, America famously had a pretty large slave population. The slave to citizen ratio in America was something like in America it was more non-slaves to slaves. But if you think just the South, where slavery was legal, it was something like 2 or 3 slaves to free person. In Haiti, it was 1,000 slaves to free person. So it was a slave revolt, and the slaves won, because when it's 1,000 people to 1, you're going to lose, right? So Pharaoh's just recognizing that the Hebrews are multiplying, lots of slaves being born. And he's like, this is not good, because we don't want more slaves than we have Egyptians, because eventually they will revolt and gain their freedom. So he comes up with this plan that we're going to deal with this kind of runaway slave population problem by killing the male children. You kill the male children, there won't be new babies. So it's just a decree, kill all the babies who are born male. And of course, he gives that command to the midwives to separate which they disobey, thankfully. Anyway, all this to say, Pharaoh gets pretty angry and aggressive when he realizes that the midwives have been protecting the male babies, and he really kind of stamps down and is like, we're going to really punish people for not giving us their babies. You have to kill the male babies. So that's the context here. And what I love about the way this is written, or sounds, I should say, to the modern English-speaking ear, it sounds like his parents were like, baby, they were ready to kill him, but then they saw he was beautiful. Like, well, if he was an ugly baby, maybe we would have gotten rid of him. So I actually did, I kind of wrestled a little bit with, like, why is it written that way? And I've read some commentators on it, and I'm not 100% certain, but it does seem that most of the commentators are agreed on how to interpret this passage, that it doesn't mean that. It doesn't really technically mean beautiful, although this is why it's tricky. The word does mean beautiful. But most people think, or most commentators think, that what it's saying is this, that the parents saw the baby, Moses, and they had some conviction, so again, this kind of belief about something that was unseen, that the baby Moses was going to do something great, and that it was really important to save him. That they had this belief by something about him that this was not a normal baby. Now, mind you, I think any parent would save their kids if they could. But I think what this is really, the only point the author of Hebrews is trying to make here is he's tying this back into the first verse. It's the assurance of things hoped for. That what is driving the parents is something is going to come down the pipe that this kid is going to be a part of. He's going to do something great. And therefore, we are going to do everything we can to save him. And here's the big thing. This is a risk to the parents. You might say, why would a parent give their child up? And the answer is, a parent might give their child up out of fear that the Egyptians will kill them. So what's happening here is they're taking a risk by trying to hide the baby. If they are found out, they may be punished, right? So they have a conviction that something's coming, and they follow through with it. And it says, and they were not afraid of the king's command. And that's how they tie it to it, right? The king is trying to instill fear. Do what I say or you're going to die. But here they're saying, we're going to choose to do what's right, what is good, rather than to choose to fear the king. And I hope you guys understand that right here, we have something that's laid out for us that is a very real thing in real life. Like you and I, we have to make moral decisions all the time. And our moral decision-making process is influenced by our fears, right? There's a story I heard a long time. It was an interview with this guy. He was in New York, standing on a subway platform with his daughter. And there was a man standing close by who all of a sudden went into an epileptic seizure. And he fell off the platform. And right as he fell off the platform and was seizing on the tracks, a train started to come. This guy, looking at the man having the epileptic seizure, jumped down, covered the man up, and held him down as the train went over his head. Left his daughter on the platform, so of course, what's the daughter thinking, no doubt? My dad just died. He just jumped down and is now underneath the train. I listened to an interview with the guy afterwards, and he goes, I saw him in the pit, and I thought, I can do this. I can do this. And he jumped down, and he saved the man's life. And here's the thing. A lot of moral decision-making, now this is kind of an extreme example, but a lot of moral decision-making is kind of made in the context of fear, right? Like, if I make the moral right choice, something bad might happen to me. Now, most of us are not going to be doing it on a train platform. Most of us are not going to be making that decision when life is on the line. But there are all sorts of things that might be on the line. Making the right, moral, correct decision might cost you your job. It might cost you your social well-being. Like friends and family who you love might reject you because you have made the right moral choice and because you're not going to cave on what they want to put on you, like by their standards. there are all sorts of pressures on us to behave in certain ways and to do certain things that are not right. And doing the right thing costs us, right? It costs us. If you ever get a chance, read Plato's Apology. It's the story of Socrates, right, as he's on trial for the stupidest trial of all time. But what I love about it is it clearly actually happened. He's put on trial for being an atheist when he wasn't an atheist. He actually asks, while he's actually the opposite of an atheist. He was, as he's being interviewed, they say one of the charges is an atheist, and he goes, when you say that, he goes, do you mean that I actually don't believe in God, or that I believe in the wrong gods? And they go, no, you don't believe. And he goes, oh, well, I can answer that. I definitely believe in God. In fact, he says the whole venture that I've gone down is just because I think God is leading me in a certain way. One of them was that he was corrupting the youth. Which is hilarious because, I don't want to go too much into it, but if you know anything about Greek history, you know that in the 4th century BC, all the men were corrupting the youth in really horrible ways, except for Socrates. So he was actually the guy not doing, maybe not literally everybody, but it was a horrible, widespread, awful practice. And so he's being accused of corrupting the youth. And then his final accusation is that he made weak arguments stronger. In other words, he made people look bad when he argued with them. And so as he goes through kind of defending himself, telling his story, there's one poignant point that he makes. At the end of he makes several, but at the end he essentially says this. He says, what you want me to do is to stop teaching the youth the truth. And what you want me to do is to stop showing where politicians are leading us astray. And what you want me to do is to do all these things that are bad. Or you want me to start doing all these things that are bad. And he says, I'm not going to listen to you. Whatever you decide, and I don't care what you decide, he says, I'm going to continue what I've been doing. I'm going to continue to teach the youth. I'm going to continue to subvert bad politicians. I'm going to continue to do all this stuff. And if you don't want me to do this, then find me guilty. They find him guilty, and you know what he says right afterwards? He's supposed to make a recommendation on what his punishment should be, having been found guilty. And so what they were expecting him to do is come out and say, give me a fine. No, he said, what I think you should do is I think you should let me go and pay me to be a moral teacher. I think that should be my punishment. He says, pay me for the rest of my life so that I can teach. And they're like, no. And he goes, then do whatever you want. And then the prosecutor says, we might kill you. And he goes, I don't care if I die. He goes, there are many things worse than death. And he says, speaking lies and ignoring your calling is worse than death. If you need to kill me, then kill me. And they chose to kill him. So my point in all of that is making good moral decisions often costs you. Not always death, not usually death, but it costs you. And the only way you can make those is if you actually believe the two things we've said before. That there is a good thing on the other end of it. An assurance of something hoped for. And a conviction that you are doing what you do for an audience of one. For God. Everybody else can hate you. Everybody else can want to kill you. But God is on your side and favors you, then you're okay. That's what this passage is saying. So the parents didn't fear the king's command. Verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he came of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Now, I want to highlight a couple things. This is probably the main verse for my message today, from what we're going to look at. There are a number of things I want to point out. Some of these are just kind of little nuanced things. So first, let me kind of address this. Moses, so now this is an act of faith by Moses. What is the thing that he does by faith? The first thing it says, he refuses to be called son of Pharaoh's daughter. Can I pause here and just say a couple of things about this? You've all seen, I presume, Prince of Egypt or 10 Commandments, right? You guys all know, I hope, Prince of Egypt, 10 Commandments does not give you what actually happened. It gives you some things that actually happen. But there are a number of things that it does in its story that is clearly false. Or maybe I shouldn't say clearly false. They're at least making leaps that we have no reason to think. So let me give you one of these. In both of those movies, they tell you that Moses' story was one in which he was destined to become potentially Pharaoh, right? He was Ramses' brother, stepbrother, and who knows, if Ramses died or didn't do his job well, maybe Moses would become Pharaoh. In the story, Moses is like this beloved son, like a son to Pharaoh. Let me just say a couple things. One, we have no idea, first of all, which Pharaoh Moses was alive. Like we don't, well, not no idea, there are arguments, but we don't know. We have no idea, though, what his relationship was like to that Pharaoh. I want to add something, though. This is the important thing. He was definitely not destined to become the next Pharaoh. Moses was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So first of all, at best, his grandson, like his adopted grandson. But the thing you need to understand is pharaohs had harems. They had hundreds of wives. And with each of these wives, they had hundreds of children. And not all of these children held positions of power and authority in the court of Egypt. It's possible Pharaoh never even met Moses or had any idea who he was, at least the old one. Well, he eventually does find out who he is because he wants to kill him, the text says this in Exodus. But we don't know what his relationship is like to Pharaoh. To kind of illustrate this, Ramses II, which is the Pharaoh that everybody thinks was Moses' Pharaoh. Ramses II, when he died, he was succeeded, like the next Pharaoh, was his 50th son. So 49 sons died before his 50th son took over as the next Pharaoh. So with Moses being a son of Pharaoh's daughter, he's not lined up for a massive, important position in Egypt. This is why this is important, and kind of to my point. Moses is going to become a very powerful leader, right? He's going to become, essentially, a dictator of a nation. Not a true dictator, as at the end of the day, he is a messenger. And I know that's his perspective and position. He's a messenger. God is telling him what to tell the nation and what to do for the nation. He goes out and he does it. So from Moses' perspective, who's the dictator? God. But from a lot of the people's perspective who were around Moses, who were with Moses, they had a different take. From their perspective, he was kind of a dictator. Why? Because they were not meeting with God. They were not hearing God's voice. They were not receiving the instructions. All they saw was that Moses would walk off either onto a mountain early on or into a tent. That a cloud of smoke would surround that tent. Moses would meet in that tent with God. And then he'd come out and tell them what to do. From their vantage point, who is their leader? Moses. And so when things don't go their way, who do they blame? Moses. They don't like Moses. And if you read through the law, the whole story of the law is essentially the people that Moses is in charge of complaining about him. You don't need to turn there, but Numbers 11, verse 11. The people are complaining, as they did so many times. They're complaining because, although God has met all their needs by doing things like causing water to pour out of a rock, by causing it to rain bread. Remember, they were hungry. They're like, why, God, didn't you kill us in Egypt? We're out here in the desert. We're going to starve. God says, okay, every day I'm just going to make it rain bread. Like he's meeting every one of their needs. And after a while, they're like, we hate this bread. It's the same thing. We're eating the same thing every day. It's terrible. So what does God do? He causes it to rain meat. He gives them quail, right? Well, when they complain about it, I love Moses' response. Actually, you can turn there if you want. Probably shouldn't. But I just love the way he says it, and I'm not going to do it justice. Turn to Numbers chapter 11 if you want. Numbers 11, verse 11. After they complain, this is what Moses says. Verse 11. So Moses said to the Lord, why have you afflicted your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give them all this people? For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me now. if I have found favor in your sight. Let me paraphrase. I mean, you guys all caught on, but essentially, what is he saying? He's saying this. What did I do to you, God? What did I do to you that you put me in charge of these people? They're miserable, and I can't give them the things they want. Like, if you hate me so much, just kill me. But no, you put me in charge. Here's why I say this. Oh, actually, let's look at one more passage. Chapter 16, same book, Numbers. Turn to 16. You have a cabal of Israelites who decide they don't like Moses' leadership. For a number of reasons. One of the big ones is they don't get to go in the promised land. You guys, I'm sure, know the story. The whole point of this venture was that they would get to go into a land flowing with milk and honey, a land promised to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what happens? They get there, they get scared, and then God says, fine, you don't believe, you don't have faith, you don't have an assurance of a thing hoped for, you don't have a conviction that I, who am unseen, am here fighting for you, fine, then you don't get to go in. So the people are mad. And they get together and they say, who led us up here to get nothing, to not even get this land of promise? Who did it? Moses. They're like, he clearly is a bad guy, so we should be in charge. This little group of people say, we should be in charge. And so look here, verse 12 of number 16. And Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, which were two of the conspirators. So he basically hears about their conspiracy. He hears that they're questioning his leadership. And what does he say? He says, come see me, I want to talk to you guys. But they said, we will not come up. Is it a small thing that you have brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? That you should keep acting like a prince over us? Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. What are they doing? They're saying, you're a terrible leader, Moses. We hate you. We disrespect you. We are not going to do what you say. And Moses gets mad again. Look here at the next verse, 17. Then Moses was angry, and he said to the Lord, do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them, nor have I hurt any of them. Why do I bring all this up? Moses, by faith, chose not to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's what the passage we just read says. By faith, Moses chose not to be called son of Pharaoh's daughter. I say this, guys, because I want you to understand what Moses gave up. Moses gave up what anybody in the world would want, which is pleasure, honor, and prosperity with no responsibility. He was not going to be Pharaoh. He was not going to be one of the leaders. I mean, he might have had a position in the government. Probably everybody did back then. But he was not going to be a significant person. He would be somebody who could always point up the ladder. There's some other guy higher up, one of Grandpa's kids. Go talk to him. He himself did not have the authority. And because he didn't have the authority, he didn't have the responsibility, which means what were the things he got? He got pleasure. Pleasure and ease, wealth and honor. Honor and prosperity, honor and prosperity. That's what he had, which is all that almost anybody wants. Even when people say they want to lead, they say they want to be in charge, that's only because they've never been in charge, right? That's it. Or they don't realize that the areas where they are in charge actually translate to the bigger parts. Because nobody loves responsibility. Nobody loves it. A lot of people are good at it. A lot of people are faithful in it, but nobody loves it. Nobody's like, what I really want is for me to be responsible for everybody and for everybody to hate me as a result, because I'm not saying that always happens, but it happens a lot. So what did Moses give up? He gave up everything anybody could have wanted. Why? He gave it up because he had a conviction that something that is unseen is there calling him to it. That he had a calling. And that as hard as that conviction would be, as difficult as all this would be for him, that in the end, it would be what is good and right. Let's go back to Hebrews 11. So, what does it say here? He gives up that position of comfort and prosperity. Verse 25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So rather than enjoying the passing pleasure of being the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he is enduring affliction with the people of God. What am I doing? I'm going to be a leader. I'm going to be a leader in the wilderness, where things are not pleasant or pleasurable, where people might not like me, and where many will turn on me, and where life is going to be hard, where we are going to go thirsty, and we're going to have to rely on God to miraculously provide us something to drink, where we are going to be hungry, and we're going to have to rely on God to miraculously give us food. Those are the things that we're going to have to do. And so he willingly does it. And how can you do such a thing? Only by faith. Only if you believe that that's what you're called to do, and that on the other end of it, there is a reward that is worth it, that makes it worth it. And you can only do it if you believe there is an audience that you cannot see who is actually there pushing you on, that audience being God. And so he does that. Look at verse 26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. I like how it says that. I don't know, you guys pick up on that? Notice again, look at it. Esteeming the reproach of Christ. Jesus was not born yet. The term Christ, when Moses was alive, it would have existed because in Hebrew, the translation of Christ to Hebrew is just the word Messiah. And Messiah just means one who is anointed, and they certainly practiced anointing. But in Moses' day, it wasn't like they had this fully formed view of what the Messiah was or who he was. They had, I think, vague sense, but not a super clear view. And they certainly didn't know that he was going to be Jesus as we understand him. And yet, what do we find here, the author of Hebrews pointing out? That Moses was a servant of Jesus. He was a servant of Jesus even way back then, that this was about the reproach of Christ. The author of Hebrews is saying, just as today, that is in his day, the church was suffering reproach for the sake of Christ, was being persecuted for the sake of Christ. He's saying Moses chose to follow Christ rather than the world. He could have had comfort. He could have had success. He could have had prosperity in Egypt, but instead he chose suffering with Jesus. Carrying on, verse 27. By faith, he forsook Egypt. So again, he left the comforts of Egypt. Can I make a comment on this real quick? I've already referenced this, that as the children of Israel are wandering in the wilderness, have fled Egypt, where they were slaves, they complained all the time. And when they did, they said, oh, that we were back in Egypt. Now think about what that meant for them. They were miserable in the wilderness. They were saying, we wish we were in Egypt, where we were what? Slaves. And they said, because in Egypt we had leeks and onions, which is, I'm like, wow, you have to be really hungry if you're dreaming about those leeks and onions, right? Like they had nothing taking care of them. At least the way that, I shouldn't say that, they had God taking care of it. What I mean is that they, in their minds, were completely unsafe. They had no stability in their minds, no structure. They didn't know where their meals were coming from, even though, of course, it was raining every day. They were sitting there thinking, what if the bread doesn't come? What if the water goes out? We don't have confidence. Let us go back to Egypt, where we can have the comfort of leeks and onions and water, all the water we want. They were complaining about the lack of comfort. But what did Moses give up? Moses gave up all the wealth of Egypt. Not literally like the riches, but just the fact that he would have lived in pure comfort. He gave it up. So what happens? He forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. As we saw, he confronts Pharaoh. He confronts Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. That was not a thing people did. People don't confront Pharaoh, one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. To do so, you risk your life. He was not afraid of that. Why? Because of things unseen. Because he had two choices. I either confront Pharaoh and risk death at the hands of Pharaoh, or I disobey God. And which of those am I going to choose? I'm going to choose to disobey Pharaoh. I'm going to choose to confront Pharaoh. Because I only live because God wants me to. Carrying on. Not fearing the wrath of the king, second half of verse 27, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses endured seeing the one who was invisible, God. I love how he says that, seeing the one who is invisible. Well, how do you see? You see with eyes of faith, right? He was able to look beyond what was obvious to everyone and see the reality that undergird everyone. And think about the power that would have in your life and mine. If we really could sit there and say, I know I might lose my job, but God is calling me to it. Think of the power it have when I say, I know I might be put to death, but God is with me. And being able to always make that decision to say, I'm going to do what God wants because I actually believe he's there to see him with eyes of faith. Continuing on. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Now, again, think about this. The Passover, the 10th judgment brought by God upon Egypt, the killing of the firstborn. Which incidentally, just as an aside, I hope you guys know the punishment on the firstborn was not necessarily on children. Did you guys know that? People always think it's kids. It's the firstborn. If I lived in Egypt, it would be on me. I'm the firstborn. So 47 years old. If you're 100 years old, if you're the firstborn, you're put to death. It was just whoever was born first in the family. We always think children, and no doubt children died because there were firstborn children. But here's the thing I want you to understand. Egypt has been given 9 plagues, right? 9 plagues. 9 judgments in which Egyptians could sit there and they could see the wrath of God. And they could come to the conclusion that, oh goodness, this God is real and he's serious. Pharaoh saw it better than anybody else. And yet when you get to the final plague, there's actually an out, right? There is actually an out. An out that would have worked for Egyptians as well as for Hebrews. That out is kill the Passover lamb and put the blood on the door. And why did people not do it? Because they didn't believe. Why did Moses do it? Because he believed. Why did Aaron do it? Because he believed. Why did the children of Israel do it? Because they believed. It's faith. It wasn't because Israel was favored. It wasn't because, Israel is favored, but it wasn't because of that. It was faith. Moses said, guys, angel of death is coming. He's going to kill the firstborn of everybody in the land, even of us. Unless you kill the Passover lamb, you put the blood above the door. So what'd they do? By faith. Because they saw something that you couldn't see, they put the blood on the door. By faith, they kept the first Passover. By faith, they kept the first Passover. Notice what it says here. Lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. The angel of death was indiscriminate. It was not just coming after Egyptians. Could have touched the Hebrews as well. But faith saved them. In the final verse from this section, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. By faith. By faith, they passed through on dry ground. Again, think back to the story. It's one you guys are all familiar with. After the 10 plagues, after the Passover, Passover brought such mourning and lamentation in the hearts of the Egyptians that Pharaoh begged the Israelites, not begged, he commanded them to leave. He was angry. Leave us, you're a curse to us. And so what happens is the children of Israel pack up their stuff. And then, oddest of things, all the people of Egypt came out and just started giving gifts to the Israelites. Just giving them gifts. Scriptures don't tell us why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was a sympathy. Maybe it was that now they actually believe that the God of Israel is real. And so what are they going to do? Because the God of Israel is the real God, they want to gain the favor of the real God. And the Egyptians walk out, the Jews walk out with an abundance of wealth that the Egyptians have left them. And so they, as the scriptures tell us, plundered the Egyptians. And they walk on. And then Pharaoh changes his mind because people change their mind, right? He gets stuck in his head and he starts thinking. At first he's like distraught, no doubt. No doubt his son died and he's hearing the weeping and lamentation of all his people. And he's just grieving. But that grief turns to anger when you think about it, right? And he says, I can't let those guys go. They killed our kids. And so what does he decide? I'm going to chase them with an army. What happens? Moses and the Israelites go there to the Red Sea. They're stopped. And I love it. What do the children of Israel immediately do? This part of the theme of the day. They complain. Was it because there weren't enough graves in Egypt? They say that. Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to kill us? Why, oh why, did we ever listen to you, Moses? What didn't occur to them is there were 10 plagues. We saw it. Everything Moses said came to pass. Everything. What that should teach us is The next thing he said is going to happen is going to happen. Moses has already told them they're going to go into the promised land. They should, with eyes of faith, know whatever the circumstance, giant body of water in front of us, large Egyptian army behind us, I don't know how it's going to happen, but everything else has happened. Eyes of faith, we're going to keep pressing on. Moses says to the people, stand still, stop complaining, and behold the salvation of the Lord. And then he starts to pray. And I love God's response. Why are you sitting there talking? Move forward. Go forward. Why are you talking to me? There's a time to pray. And there's a time not to pray. Meaning there's a time to act. And it's so funny. Our flesh tells us not to pray when we're supposed to pray. But it also tells us to pray when we're not supposed to pray. I'll give you a simple example. I'm a teacher. And I'm a procrastinator. So I tend to not get my work done very quickly and on time. And as a result, there are these hard deadlines that come, like report cards and things like that. And I often have stacks of papers to grade. And I can't tell you, multiple times when I'm sitting there and it's like, I have like 15 hours before report cards are due. I have hundreds of papers to grade. And I'm sitting there and I'll sit there and I'll get down on my knees and I'll just start praying. Every single time I've ever done that, I remember the verse. Every time. I feel like the Lord is saying, what are you doing? Grade. Why are you praying? You're so bad at praying when you're supposed to be praying. Like, pray in the moments when you're supposed to be praying. Don't pray when you need to get grading done. Grade when you need to get grading done. You got to learn. That's a thing. Moses is a leader, and he needs to know when he's supposed to be praying for the people and when he's supposed to be leading the people. And so God says, what are you doing standing around? Go in. And again, eyes of faith. What does he see? He sees a sea. Go in, we're all going to die. We're not going to swim across the Red Sea. Go in. And it's when he walks in that the waters part. And then they go through on dry ground. And then Pharaoh and his armies come in and pass over. Continuing to look at verse 29 again. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. When the Egyptians come in and try, they're drowned. Now, that's the end of the section that I'm teaching today. But it's not the end of the story of Moses, and I very much want to tie this whole section we just read back to a moment ago. I said there are two main verses that I think are definitive for all of Hebrews 11. The first is the first verse, where it's defining faith for us. The second is verse 11, which, if you look at all these people, all these stories he's telling, especially last week. I taught last week at Cole, and I taught the passage that you guys all went through. And especially last week's, I feel like it was really emphasized here, but it's present here as well. Look at verse 11. These all, meaning all these heroes, died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. The thing you guys need to understand about all these heroes of faith, and something that is so important to understand in this chapter, something the author of Hebrews is trying to drive into your skulls, is this fundamental fact. And this ties into that first verse, the assurance of things hoped for. So many people have faith, that is, they believe in God and trust in God for an outcome that they want. And it's like they're motivated purely for that outcome. And when that outcome doesn't happen, they lose faith. You understand? I still remember my cousin. I was sharing the gospel with him. Actually, he's my cousin's husband, but I was sharing the gospel with him, and he goes, "Don't talk to me about God. I'll never believe God." And I'm like, "Why is that?" And he goes, "I held my brother in my arms when he died. There is no God." I understand that sentiment. I think it's a sentiment that any human would be tempted to feel and have. But The author of Hebrews here is trying to say, faith is not about any temporal thing. Any of it. All these great men and women of the past died in faith, not having received the promise. Abraham received the first promise that the land he dwelt in would be his and his descendants forever. And Abraham's like, sounds great. When is it? And God's response was, 400 years after you die. That's it. Oh, Abraham, my big promise to you. The story begins, Genesis 12, with Abraham. Leave your home there in modern-day Iraq. Leave Ur. Go to a land I will show you. I will give it to you and your children forever. Sounds great. But his whole life, he never had a home again. He was a nomad and a wanderer traveling in a land of people who worshiped foreign gods, spoke a foreign language, and he never had a place to call his own. He bought one strip of land in his lifetime, and you know what it was for? For burying his loved ones. That's it. But God says, don't worry, 400 years after you die, your descendants will come into the land. And any normal human would say, well, great. Like, what does that do for me? I don't care what happens 400 years after I die. He died in faith, not having received the promises. But he embraces the promise. And by embracing the promise, what's he saying? He's confessing he is a stranger and a pilgrim in this land, meaning this world is not actually the world he wants. It's not his home. And so we have Moses. Guys, you all know the story of what ends up with Moses, right? It's so sad to me. Moses, man, I think he's not counting Jesus, I think he's my second favorite character in the Bible. I know we probably shouldn't rank, but I'm a ranker. I rank everything, literally. Restaurants, movies, TV shows. Not only do I rank everything, when I talk to people and we have conversations, I want to know their ranks. What is your favorite? And I've done it my whole life. I think Moses is my second favorite, behind Abraham. Moses does this thing. Their explanations, I don't even think the explanation doesn't matter. I think we're supposed to go, why in the world that happened? He strikes the rock when God told him to speak to the rock. He sits there and the children of Israel are complaining again, like always. And he goes, you rebels, do you want me to bring water from this rock? And he smacks the rock when God told him to speak to it. Water pours forth and God says, whoops, that's it. You don't get to go in the promised land. Guys, his whole life was for that aim, right? Like, that's the reward, that's the payoff. He gave up Egypt. By the way, I forgot to mention this. He also gave up comfort and peace, living in a nice little pastoral life, meaning shepherding, working serving under his father-in-law, being married, having kids, very normal. I mean, not easy, but quiet life. And he gave that up. And he gave it all up because there was a promise that the children of Israel would get the promised land. He just wants the promised land. Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 3. Book of Deuteronomy is like Moses' final sermon. He's got all the people together, and he's about to die, and he knows it. And he gets up and reviews the law for them, kind of goes through all the main commandments, all that kind of stuff. He's a little salty, though. Look at what he says here in verse 26 of chapter 3. But the Lord was angry with me on your account. Right? So what's he saying? He's like, I don't get to go in with you guys. Why? Because of you guys. I don't get to go in because of you. Because you guys were constantly throwing tantrums and making me mad. I didn't get to go in on your account. And here's this. You could read this and be really sad. Look at this. And he would not listen to me. He would not listen to me. So the Lord said to me, enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter. What is God saying? Enough of that. Don't speak to me about this again. Moses is like, he doesn't say it, but we know what he's like, God, please. I just want to go. I just want to go into the promised land. Please. Moses is not trying to toot his own horn, but, well, maybe he is. I don't know. The book of, the first 5 books of the Bible say really good things about Moses. Just to kind of set it up a little bit, right? What does it say about Moses? He's the humblest man in the world. His brother and sister complained against his leadership, Aaron and Miriam. They actually said, why does he get to make all the decisions? We're prophets. We speak to God. You know what God says? God says, Aaron, Miriam, present yourselves at the tent. I always picture like a parent saying, time to go back to the woodshed, right? We're going to present yourself at the tent. And they come to the tent, and they say, and God says to them, he says, in the history of my people Israel, there will be prophets and seers, and they will have dreams and visions, and they will speak truth to my people. And he says, but that is not the way it is with Moses. This is exactly what it says in the text. It says, he is faithful in all my house. I think that could probably be interpreted different ways, but the way I see it, how I read it is, he's saying, Moses is the best. Of all of you, he's the best. He says, he is faithful in all my house. He says, I speak to the prophets and seers in dreams and visions. That's not how I speak to Moses. He says, to Moses I speak as a man speaks. To Moses I speak face to face. Meaning in all the history of all the people ever, there's only one guy who actually I talked to and told him what to do. And that's Moses. And then God says, so how could you dare to speak a word against my servant Moses? Guys, right? How could you dare to speak a word against my servant Moses? He's the best. He's the best. And all he did was hit the rock. I mean, when I was a kid, I was like, what? I mean, I remember hearing in Sunday school, Moses didn't go in the promised land. Why? He hit the rock. I'm like, what? And I know, like, he got mad. Yeah, but he got mad lots of times. We read another verse. He got mad all the time. Don't listen to these people, Lord. I've never taken a thing from them. It says his anger was aroused for whatever reason. And there are theories, and I have my ideas. It doesn't really matter. The point is he doesn't get to go in. And what is Moses saying here at the end of his life? He's saying, I begged him. I pleaded, Lord, please, I just want to go. And what does God say? No, never speak to me about it again. You're not going in. You're not going in. Verse 27, go up to the top of Pisgah and lift your eyes toward the west, the north, the south, the east. Behold it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan. Meaning you're not going to cross the Jordan River and come into the promised land. But command Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over before this people. He shall cause them to inherit the land which you will see. He's angry. God got angry at me because of you guys, and I don't get to go in. It's the only thing I want. I just want to go in. He's not going to give it to me. That's, guys, every person who believes is going to have that in their lives. Moses is not alone in this. We're all going to have that thing we wanted. I wanted that. And God, you didn't give it to me. Why? I don't know why. I don't have the answer for the why. I think probably that's the main reason he doesn't just say why. Because we need to know he doesn't tell us all the time. We sometimes just don't get it. These all died in faith, not having received the promise. And that is supposed to be a hope and encouragement to us. That I may not receive the promise in this life, but I have to hold fast to the end. Hebrews 12, that's the main point of this whole thing. He's saying, run with endurance the race that is set before you. Do not quit. Hold fast to the end. Moses held fast to the end. He did not quit. Skip to the end of Deuteronomy. Final chapter. Verse 34. Or chapter 34, sorry. He has now finished his sermon. He has spoken to the people. And after he's done, it says in verse 1, then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is what God told him to do and where to go, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead, as far as Dan, all Naphtali. He basically saying all of the land of Israel. He goes up to a high point. He looks out over it all. He sees it all. God's showing him this is his gift to him. You don't get to go in, but you get to see it. I'm going to let you see it. Carrying on, verse 4. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I've caused you to see it with your eyes. I have given you this blessing. You get to see it. But you shall not cross over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. Meaning, as God said he would. He doesn't get to go in. Joshua will lead the people. He died not receiving the promise. And this verse, I told you guys Moses is like my second favorite. This verse is the one that did it for me. It's not the first time I read it, but there was a point when I read this and I just wept. Never noticed it the first 100 times or whatever I read this. Verse 6, and he buried him in a valley of the land of Moab. Who's he? God. He buried him. Like when I think of this, right? I think about Genesis chapter 2. God had planted a garden. Now I know God's not like us. He doesn't plant things the way we plant things. But when it says, I love the way Genesis chapter 2 says it. He planted a garden. Not he created a garden, not he spoke into existence. It says he planted. And so what do you see mentally? You see God out there like digging up and hoeing the earth and planting seeds. He's a gardener. He's planting a garden. And then once the garden grows up, and he says he fashions man out of the dust. He's like picking up the dirt and fashioning and breathing into him. He's doing physical, tactile things is the way it's describing it. And then what does it say? It says in chapter 2 that God walked in the garden, or Adam walked in the garden, in the coolness of the garden with God. So again, what's the language? We're here together, walking, talking together. And what's the language here? And he buried him. It's like funeral, right? We all want the people we love the most to be there. But it's like God's like, this one's going to be special. This is just for me and Moses. And I picture God just digging the hole and putting the body in and covering it up, showing his deep love and affection for this man. Which is important. Because if you didn't have that end, you would think that Deuteronomy 3 would make it sound like God hated Moses or was really angry with him. But the reality is God's ways just aren't our ways. His plans aren't our plans. And so there are these things we might really want to see. And he might have decided we're not going to get to see them. But that's okay, because what he has in store is so much bigger and better. And so Moses died in faith, not having received the promise. But guess what? He gets it. He gets the promise. Yeah, it's way in the future. It's not on his timeline. It's not the way he would have done it. Just like with Abraham. 400 years after you die. It's way in the future. It's not how you would have done it. But you're going to get the promise. And the same thing, guys, is true for you and for me. We have to see with eyes of faith. We have to believe and hold fast. Because the promises that we want so badly, they're in the future. Yeah, we haven't received them. Yeah, we haven't seen them. Yeah, we may not receive them in this lifetime. But hold fast, because what God has is so much better. And you can only hold to that and see it with eyes of faith. With those things in mind, guys, I'm going to go ahead and invite the ushers up and the worship team. We're going to partake of communion. And just want to remind you guys that communion is an act that you partake in with eyes of faith. You have to see things that aren't like physically present, aren't really there. The bread you eat, the cup you drink from, it's not really Jesus' body. It's not really his blood, not literally, not physically. But you have to, when you see it, and when you eat of it, and when you take it, it's like you have to see through the physical to the spiritual reality that Jesus died, and that his death was real, and that you partake in his death really and truly. And that when you eat and drink, you are receiving of his life. And you also have to see through, like when we're doing it, we're a bunch of disparate individuals sitting here eating. But what you have to do is see through that and see that we are the body of Christ in the world. And we're not only celebrating this together right now, we're like in this place, we're celebrating it with all the believers all across the face of the globe today. The body of Christ today is partaking in his body and in his blood. And so let us stand and celebrate that together.